Well, colleagues, thank you for staying here to the end of the day. And I must admit, in all honesty, that I come to you somewhat, I usually come heavy of heart, but I'm even heavier of heart today, because as we're sitting here, we all know that there are places in the world, in the Ukraine, in the Middle East, for example, where as we sit here, human beings are being torn apart, are being burned to death, are being destroyed in all of the ways that we modern human beings have invented to destroy other people. And when I think about that, and then I think about our responsibility as academics and our ability to address these problems, I must admit that I become rather despondent sometimes, because when I think of all of the bombs and the smart bombs and the dumb bombs and the nuclear bombs that those other folks have, what do we academics have? Words. All right? And ideas. And maybe we even have some wisdom. Maybe. All right? But the question is, what can words do against an atomic bomb? All right? And when I think about that, I become rather despondent, because I feel words are so weak in comparison with all of the other instruments of war that exist. On the other hand, the good side of the story is that words are powerful, and that ideas are powerful. And that while it may be true that once a war starts, there are very few things that any of us can do to stop it, there are things we can do to prevent it, not only in our own minds, but especially when we talk to our students. And we give them the information they need to try to understand what's really going on, and not what the mass media is claiming is going on, all right? And not what our governments are claiming is going on, but we academics hopefully have access and have the ability to read between the lines. And I think perhaps, in my mind, the most important weapon that we have as academics besides words is knowledge. But then beyond knowledge is the ability to help our students and ourselves to see whatever conflicts we encounter from the other side, to walk in the other person's shoes, to help our students and ourselves understand that when there is conflict, there are always reasons for the conflict. The people on the other side are not the devil. They are our fellow human beings. They may be mistaken, but they have a point of view. And it's important for us not only to present to our students what our government's point of view, or even our own point of view, but to help our students understand the other point of view. And that maybe, just maybe, that when people understand the other person's point of view, they will say, well, maybe we need to sit down and talk about this before we blow each other up. That's my hope. And so that's one of the reasons that I'm presenting today on this question of the Senkakus, which probably is not on the top of your agenda for a cause of war, but here in Japan, it is an important item that could lead to war, in this case between Japan and China, and probably between the US, Japan, and its allies against China. So this is only one small part of the conflict, but yet in Japan it's an important part of the conflict. So let's see, and I'm going to be trying purposely to present the other side, as well as the other side, in this case is the Chinese side, as well as the Japanese side. And needless to say, I'm neither Japanese nor Chinese, so hopefully that means I'm somewhat neutral. But the United States, as we'll see, is definitely not neutral, nor, of course, is the Japanese, nor the Chinese government's neutral. So we somehow have to try to find some truth from all of their positions, and somehow we have to try to put ourselves in the other person's shoes to see why they think and regard the Senkakus as such a major issue. Okay? All right, so to whom do the Senkaku, or in Chinese, the Diaoyu Islands belong, and why should we care? So let's begin with a brief introduction to the Senkakus, known in Chinese then as the Diaoyu Islands. And here we see their location. All right. Ownership of these islands currently under Japanese administration. This is a key word. Currently under Japanese administration. All right. Is claimed not only by Japan, but by the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China on Taiwan. All right. So note that these islands are located to the northwest of a deeper part of the Pacific Ocean known as the Okinawan Trough. All right. So it's a little hard, but this is the Okinawan Trough. That means that it's a much deeper part of the ocean. You can see that the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean begins on this other side. But here, this is called the continental shelf of China. So the Diaoyu Islands are actually on the Chinese continental shelf. Okay. All right. Okay, and here is a much better example then of, you can see here, this is what the Okinawan Trough looks like. Now, actually this ocean, Japan seems very close to China, but it's never really been that close. Why? Because the East China Sea is a shallow ocean. Now, when you think of a shallow ocean, you think, well, that should be easy to cross if it's shallow. But actually, what that means is that when a typhoon or a strong wind comes, that there are billowing waves. And so it's actually much more difficult to get across an ocean that is shallow than it is to get across an ocean that is deep. All right? So it's been very difficult. So a lot of Japanese culture that we think of as coming from China actually arrived in Japan from Korea and not directly from China. So it's only been more recent that it was possible to go between the two countries. But at any rate, at an early date, there was traffic between the Chinese continent and the Ryukyu Islands, which was then an independent country. So these are the islands that are under dispute. All right? They're basic, and they are all uninhabited. Some people have tried to live on that largest island in the past, but they didn't last long because it's too small, there's no fresh water, too small to grow food, etc. So they've always basically been uninhabited from ancient times to the present. So in size, they're from 800 square meters to 4.32 square kilometers in size. So the Senkaku Islands were first mentioned in a 15th century Chinese document describing a voyage to the Ryukyu Islands. As I said, the Ryukyu Islands were then an independent country. By the 17th century, Chinese sources clearly named the maritime boundary between the Senkaku Islands and the Ryukyus as the He Shui Go, or the Black Water Trench, also known then as the Okinawan Trench, in an area of high turbulence that marks the edge of China's continental shelf. In 1720, Deputy Chinese envoy Xu Baoguang collaborated with local Ryukyuan authors to compile the travelogue Zhongshan Zhuanxinglu, or the record of the mission to Chusan, which demarcated the westernmost border of the Ryukyu kingdom as Kumejima, south of the Heishuigo Trench. Okay, so now for a little historical background. So Japan first annexed the Ryukyu kingdom in 1879, creating Okinawa Prefecture. However, it was not until 1885 that the governor of Okinawa, Nishimura Seizo, petitioned the Meiji government to take control of the uninhabited Senkaku Islands. In response, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Inoue Kaoru, noted that the islands lay near the border area with China and already had Chinese names. Inoue also cited an article in a Chinese newspaper charging that Japan was occupying islands off China's coast. Inoue feared that a Japanese claim on the islands would anger China, possibly leading to a war for which Japan was not yet prepared. Inoue's concerns convinced Yamagata Aritomo, Minister of the Interior, to refuse the governor's request, at least for the time being. Notice I say, at least for the time being. He refused. Why? Because Japan was not yet certain that if it engaged in a war with China, that it would win. China's a much bigger country than Japan. All right. So nevertheless, Japan attacked China in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894. Japan secretly, this is important, Japan secretly took control of the Senkaku Islands at that time. Well, I say, in the closing stages of that war, on 14 January 1895, Japan secretly took control of the Senkaku Islands. By this time, Japan was certain of victory in the war and knew there was nothing China could do about it. Thus, Japan ensured it would at least succeed in acquiring the Senkakus, even if European powers blocked its acquisition of colonies on the Chinese mainland. This is exactly what happened, for Russia, Germany, and France forced Japan to abandon its plans for a colony on the Liaodong Peninsula. Instead, the Western powers permitted Japan to seize the island of Taiwan and nearby islands. So the current problem with Taiwan actually has its roots in the Japanese colonization of Taiwan from 1895. A little more historical background. This is a French illustration from the 1890s, and it shows that Japan was far from the only imperialist power intent on carving China up to enlarge and enrich its empire. In particular, the British, with the later assistance of the French, fought two wars in the mid-1800s to force China to allow the import of vast quantities of opium from India in the name of free trade. Have we heard those words before, folks? Free trade. Nothing's more important than free trade. Popularly known as the Opium Wars, this effectively meant that the government of the British Empire became one gigantic drug dealer. The entire British government was a drug dealer. All right. So, and then China's defeat allowed Britain to take over Hong Kong and many other parts of China. All right. Next, Japan attacked China in the first. Oh, I'm sorry, we went the wrong way here. Okay. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the slide a minute. Because you can see the Chinese gentleman there throwing up his hands and say, "Don't take part of my country." And who's he telling that to? There's Queen Victoria. Sad to say I share a name with her. But at any rate, in my defense, it was her first name, and it's my last name. All right. So there's Queen Victoria, and then there's Bismarck, and then there's the Tsar, Russian Tsar, and of course, La Belle France. And we have our samurai Japanese, and they're all deciding what part of China shall we take next. Okay. So, in short, Japan's acquisition of the Senkakus was the result of its victory over China. However, Japan's secret takeover of the Senkaku occurred a few months before it had acquired Taiwan and nearby islands in the Treaty of Shimonoseki, signed on 17 April 1895. This secret takeover before the formal peace treaty allowed Japan to claim that neither the Potsdam Declaration nor the San Francisco Peace Treaty at the end of World War II required Japan to relinquish control of the islands, since they had not been acquired through war, but were, the Japanese government claimed, an inherent part of its territory. So now the question, what has America? What is America's position about the Senkakus? Since the Nixon administration, the United States has taken the position that territorial sovereignty over the Senkakus was to be decided by the claimants involved, that is, Japan, China, and Taiwan. This, however, changed in 2014 when Barack Obama became the first U.S. president to verbally declare that the United States would defend the islands if attacked, since they were currently under Japanese administration. In February 2017, U.S. President Donald Trump further enhanced the U.S. commitment to the Senkakus. In a joint declaration with former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, Trump expressly stated that the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty applies to the Senkakus and that the United States opposes all unilateral actions aimed at contesting Japan's administration over the islands. Trump became the first U.S. president to express in writing the U.S. obligation to defend the Senkakus without mentioning the provisional nature of Japanese sovereignty. Now, so there's a bit of the history. And now the question is, why should we care about these 5 little uninhabited islands? Who cares about them? Why should we care about them? All right? Well, here's a rather vivid photograph of why we should care. You see the China Coast Guard, and that is the other ship is the Japanese Coast Guard. And each of them claims that the other is in its territorial waters. This is off the coast of the Senkaku Islands. So up until this time, they have engaged, they yell at each other. They say, the Japanese say, "Go away, go away." The Chinese say, "Go away, go away." So far, they haven't actually shot at each other. No violence so far. But it could happen at any time. One of the ships gets too close and rams the other ship. All right. Somebody decides it's dangerous and they fire at the other ship. So there is that potential every day. Every day these ships are out. They're off the waters of the Senkaku Islands, and they're trying to face each other down. That's number one why we should care. So what are the Japanese people being told about? What do the Japanese newspapers? How do they explain this whole situation to the Japanese people? So what is notable in the Japanese mass media is the near complete absence of an accurate historical account of how the Senkaku Islands became Japanese territory. The Japanese government simply says that the islands have been part of its territory since 1895. Japanese ownership is justified on the basis that Japan conducted a survey of the islands in 1884 and found them to be terra nullius, that means uninhabited, with no evidence to indicate they were under China's control. The war-related events of 1895, that is the first Sino-Japanese War, they are never discussed in the Japanese mass media. Only that the islands have been part of Japan since 1895. Now, how does this fit in, this whole question fit in with American military strategy in Asia? Guess what? There you have all of the American bases. Here's Japan, and here to the south is Australia. These are all of the American military bases pointed at China. And secondarily North Korea, but North Korea is not really, for the U.S., is not a major problem. And this all goes as part of the U.S. military containment policy of China. And so you can see here that they have, there's two lines. This is called the first island chain, begins in Japan, comes down through Taiwan, here, Philippines, and around. This is the second island chain. Okay? And so those are both military chains designed to make certain that the Chinese Navy will never have free access to the Pacific Ocean. Okay? Now, secondly, there's been a lot of controversy, of course, about this presentation is really not about the South China Sea. This is the South China Sea. One of the first things, though, we should mention about the South China Sea is that the so-called 9-dash line that is currently promoted by the People's Republic of China, that line was established not by the communist government, it was established by the nationalist government on Taiwan. They were the ones who created it. Now, the People's Republic of China continues to promote that line. And the question is, why do they do that? They do that because 90% of all of China's oil comes through what is called the Malacca Straits here. All right. America is well known. If there were to be tension, America is well known that the first thing that it does to put the screws on an economic blockade on a country it doesn't like is to cut their oil. And that's why the South China Sea is so important and for the Chinese Navy, because they need to defend their access to oil. And as you may know, it was when America cut off its oil supply to Japan in 1941, that was the cause of Pearl Harbor. So access to oil still remains a very major cause of war. But again, let's come back. This is focused on the Senkakus. So the U.S. is currently implementing a plan to draw Taiwan into a direct military confrontation with China. The plan is similar to the strategy the U.S. used in Ukraine and earlier in Pearl Harbor to provoke Russia, in this case in the Ukraine, to provoke Russia into invading the country by threatening its national security. because you see NATO had a plan to put cruise missiles into the Ukraine, aimed at Russia. That was the plan, the original plan. This is the first phase of a broader containment strategy designed to preserve America's top spot in the global order by preventing China from becoming the region's dominant economy. According to the 2022 National Security Strategy of the U.S., China is, quote, America's most consequential geopolitical challenge, a country that was, quote, intent to reshape the international order. The NS report emphasized the critical role the military will play in the impending confrontation with China. Quote, we will modernize and strengthen our military so it is equipped for the era of strategic competition with major powers. America will not hesitate to use force to defend our national interests. So, Japan's in a predicament. What's Japan's predicament? On the one hand, its major trading partner is China. On the other hand, its major military protector is the U.S. In this confrontation between the U.S. and China, what will Japan do? Whose side will they be on? That's the predicament Japan finds itself in. In theory. In theory. Why do I say in theory? So the question Japan faces is whether it will be drawn ever deeper into the continually, increasingly hostile policies of the United States toward China, a country that also happens to be Japan's largest trading partner. Ongoing escalation, if left unaddressed, brings with it the danger that a spark between the U.S. and China could turn into an armed conflict over Taiwan, a conflict that would inevitably involve Japan. Now, remember I said in theory Japan is in a predicament, but Japan has already, the Japanese government and the Japanese military have already made their choice. The only people who don't know about the choice is the Japanese people. They don't know. But the government and the military already knows. Why do I say that? So we have here, this is August 29th of 2023. The General Yoshihide says, we cannot maintain Japan's security with our current capabilities. The international community is at a critical juncture on whether it can prevent unilateral changes in the status quo by force and maintain an international order based on the rule of law. Japan is on the front lines of this fight in the Indo-Pacific. All right? And here's one indication of what the Japanese military has already decided to do. It has built the first 2 aircraft carriers it has since World War II. Now, if you look at those aircraft carriers, you'll see that on the deck of this particular one are helicopters. So when they built the aircraft carrier, they told the Japanese people, oh, we need, when we have a nuclear accident or when we have an earthquake, we'll need to send relief efforts. And we'll need helicopters to ferry in the food and the water and so forth. And that's why we need aircraft carriers. But all along, the plan was this. Here's the real plan. These are American U.S. F-35B fighter jets. And the F-35B is able to take off in a short space and land vertically. And therefore, they're a perfect fit for Japan's new aircraft carriers. And Japan is going to purchase at least 40 of these next year or the year after, as soon as they can. So the Japanese government's military white paper of 28 July 2023 makes clear that China is the primary target of its current massive military buildup. China is repeatedly accused of, quote, continuing and amplifying in its unilateral changes to the status quo by force. In the east, that means the Senkakus, in the East and South China Seas. The threat posed by China is used to justify an increase in military spending in the 2023 to 2027 period to 43 trillion yen, that's US $300 billion, a 56.5 increase over the previous 5-year period. This represents a doubling of Japan's annual military spending and will make its military the third strongest in the world. The US, China, and Japan. And yet, Japan has a what? A peace constitution that says Japan will never, ever go to war. It refuses. The peace constitution says we do not recognize the right of belligerency of the state. That is, the Japanese government, in the constitution, says the country cannot ever go to war again. It's in the constitution, the peace constitution. And yet, it will soon have the third strongest military in the world. Now, why doesn't the Japanese government simply change the constitution? That's simple enough. The Japanese people have a perfect right to change it. They don't want to change the constitution. The Japanese people want peace. But the Japanese government, together with the American government and the military, have already made their decision. So, in conclusion then, if the war in the Ukraine is a great tragedy, which I think we all agree it is, the increasingly likely war between the US, Japan, and allies with China will be many, many times worse, possibly leading to a nuclear war. This is a great tragedy to which 5 tiny uninhabited islands, the Senkakus or the Diaoyu, will have played their assigned role. For the sake of all concerned, most especially the Chinese and Japanese peoples, the dispute over the Senkakus should not be left to fester and grow even more intractable. Instead, the Japanese government should honestly admit the way in which it acquired the Senkakus and seek an equitable diplomatic solution as soon as possible. This holds true for the dispute between the US and China as well. That said, my colleagues, I doubt it'll happen. Unless all of us in this room talk to our students, talk to the people around us, and say, we can't let it happen again. So partly, it's up to all of us. All right. I leave that thought with you, and thank you for your attention. And by the way, I would like some Q&A. Do we have a little time for Q&A?
We have about 4 minutes.
4 minutes left. All right. Now, I would like to give the floor to anyone who would like to defend the Japanese position. Anybody who would like to defend it, let's have them give them a chance to say something first. Okay. Anybody here wants to defend the Japanese government, the Japanese military?
This is recorded, Brian, so you might be taken away.
Okay.
Any questions for Brian?
And comments. Criticism is welcome too, folks, not just questions.
There's one here.
Thank you so much for this wonderful and insightful presentation. I really enjoyed it. It was especially gratifying to hear how the current impasse between Taiwan and China started. So it was very insightful from that perspective. But and also, I mean, the concept of terrorists, which gave rise to, as you said, to Japan's occupation of those islands, is one that has been traveling. I mean, because if you think of other countries as well, that it was used to dislodge indigenous communities across the world from their ancestral land, and has led to sort of problems like this, even in other countries as well. So I'm interested to hear from you what do and the reason why I'm asking this question is that I realized many years when I used to live here that the US still maintain, I don't know if it's still the case even now, still have naval bases in most parts of Japan, you know, but it was 20 years ago. I don't think it did. So which means they never. Sorry?
We've got 2 minutes left. Any questions?
Okay. So I wanted to hear your perspective. I mean, going forward, how is this going to turn out? Yeah, this the Japanese situation with regard to those islands in relation to world conflicts.
So there was about indigeneity, which I do think is an important part, because you referenced Taiwan and the Ryukyu. So there's the Chinese, the Japanese, and then there are these other islands. So indigeneity and indigenous populations within that. That was one part of the question.
Well, I'm not certain. I'm still not certain. I still don't grasp the question.
So what of the role of indigenous peoples in the islands? Because you didn't speak of, you said there were separate states, the Ryukyu, and then before the Taiwanese, which had claims over these islands.
Oh, okay. Well, to the best of my knowledge, the Chinese have never claimed, they've never made a claim on the Ryukyu Islands. They've always, in the Middle Ages, they recognized that as an independent kingdom. Although, like so many things in Asia, in East Asia, there was a tributary relationship between the two. So, the Ryukyu kingdom did pay some tribute to the Chinese government at the time, the Chinese Empire. But the interesting thing about that tributary relationship was that the Chinese always gave more back to the people who gave them gifts than the gifts themselves. So there's no danger whatsoever of China trying to take over Okinawa. But on that point, recently, about a couple, 2 or 3 months ago, the governor of Okinawa, who is anti-base, he's against all the American bases in Okinawa, he went to China on his own. And the Japanese government was really angry because he went there basically to say, look, you know, we Okinawans don't want to get in the middle of the next war, because with the American base, I did leave this out. I actually am also a former intelligence analyst for U.S. Forces Japan. All right? And so I know from my own personal experience with my own eyes that the missiles and the cruise missiles, the buildup that Japan is currently engaged in, is not to defend Japan. It is to defend the American military bases located in Japan. All right?
Okay.
And so the governor went to China to say, we don't want to be a part of that. We don't want to be in the middle of that. And that truly angered the Japanese government, but they couldn't stop him from going. We'll have to see what happens.
Right.